Good afternoon.
Oh, afternoon.
Good afternoon today. The date is November 16, 2021, and the time is 4:36 p.m. To ensure that we have a quorum present, I'm going to read out the names of the members of the executive committee, and if you are here, please say present. I'm here. Colin Clark.
Present.
John Davison. Cameron Johnson. Ed Taria.
Present.
Andre McEwen.
Present.
Lyle Melville.
Present.
John McPherson.
Present.
James Staton. Michael Stack. John Becker. Ryan Moss. So we have.
And John should be elected in
Thank you. I note here that we have a quorum of the executive committee present. I'll call to order this executive committee meeting of the Board of Education. I'm first going to turn it over to Alex Burke, our Chief Legal Officer, to see if there's any community and foreign speakers who have signed up.
Great, thanks, Richard. We do not have any community speakers this evening.
Okay. Great. Then the next order of business is to consider take action on approving the 2021 fiscal year audit. This is always an important and significant endeavor, and I'll hand it over to Jim, our CFO, and the audit firm Weaver for details. Jim?
Okay, I would like to introduce John DeBarrel. He is our audit ops partner. And Meredith Churchill was the main manager on this engagement, and I appreciate what we got done in the last couple months. But John, hand it over to you, and the clicker, you have the clicker.
Thanks, Jim. And thank you, everyone, for allowing us to meet with you this afternoon to present the results of the fiscal year 2021 audit. And as Jim mentioned, I'm John DeBarrel. I'm the audit partner on the engagement. Meredith Churchill was the manager on this year's engagement. And yesterday we had an opportunity to meet with the audit committee and go through the audit in detail. And we have for you a presentation that goes through a number of things. It gives a little bit of an introduction to our firm and the audit process itself. Goes through some of our required communications, and then the most important thing they want to hear are the audit results. And then I've got a couple of slides that have some financial information from this year's and last year's financial statements. And
then finally, the board has to approve the audit.
yes.
Last.
Joining Meredith and I on the team this year was James Boateng, who served as the senior associate. He basically ran the day-to-day field work, and we had some other associates with James. And just to kind of give you a flavor for the audit process itself, we began the audit back in June with interim field work, and I'll go into a little bit of detail on that. We came back in the end of September and beginning of October to perform the brunt of our field work. As I mentioned earlier, we met with the audit committee yesterday to go through the detail of the audit, and in between now and next year's audit, I always make myself and my staff available to Jim and his staff, because a lot of times that's when you need answers to questions when the transactions are actually happening. And that being said, I'd like to just take a moment to thank Jim and Bessie and the rest of the finance staff. They really did a great job in preparing for this year's audit and made it a very successful audit, as you'll hear. Our audit process is what they call a risk-based approach, where we look at areas of higher risk and we try to tailor our resources more heavily in those areas that are more susceptible to misstatement. And I've listed a couple of those things, such as revenue recognition, federal grant revenue, expenses and compliance with the federal grants, and then capital projects, purchasing and bidding requirements. And we performed our audit in accordance with generally accepted auditing standards, as well as generally accepted government auditing standards, and what's known as the uniform guidance, which is the standards that oversee the federal financial assistance audits. And I mentioned that we came out in June and perform interim field work. And at that point in time, the books aren't closed yet, so we concentrate our efforts at those times looking at internal controls and doing what they call walkthroughs of the significant accounting transaction cycle. And I've named some of those here. We looked at the cash disbursement cycle, including purchasing and credit cards, the cash receipts cycle, payroll, and the financial reporting and close, and that includes both budget, PIMS, as well as journal entries. And at that time, we also tried to identify the federal financial assistance programs that need to be audited. And because of the COVID pandemic world that we've been living in for the past year and a half, this was a difficult process in general for all entities because there is so much COVID finance-related grants these days. And what we found out was there were actually three major programs that had to be audited as part of the federal financial assistance this year. The first being coronavirus relief fund, and that included expenditures of both this year and last year because, not to go into too much detail, but last year the organization incurred what are called pre-award costs, and they did that properly. But the grant agreement wasn't actually issued by TA until after the fiscal year end, so we had to audit that as a major program. There was also the child nutrition cluster that had to be audited once again this year, and the what's known as the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund, or ESSER, as you probably heard. Those were all partially to fully funded with COVID money, so they were all major programs that had to be audited. And I'm happy to report that there were no findings, there were no issues with any internal control deficiencies over compliance, so those were all handled properly. We also did compliance testing, both with the Public Funds Investment Act, as well as TEA has many various compliance requirements that we tested the schools' compliance with and found no issues there. And we also performed tests of controls over cash disbursements, payroll disbursements, and journal entries. And when we came back in the fall, we concluded our testing on the single audit as well as on the financial statement audit. And we use a variety of techniques such as sampling, vouching, and so forth to test the account balances as well as the activity for the year. And this is where we're getting some of the good stuff. Even though the required communications were required to tell you about our responsibility under the different standards. And the first one is our responsibilities under generally accepted auditing standards, and it's to express an opinion on your financial statements for fiscal year 2021. I'm happy to report that we've issued an unmodified opinion, which means that we feel that the financial statements are fairly presented in all material respects and GAAP. We also have responsibilities under government auditing standards to issue a written report on our consideration of the internal controls of the school over financial reporting and on compliance. And I'm happy to report that there were no findings in that report. And then we have a third set of responsibilities under the uniform guidance. And to paraphrase, it's basically to express an opinion on the school's compliance with the major federal financial assistance programs based on our audit procedures. And as I mentioned, we have to report that there were no findings and there were no material weaknesses or significant deficiencies over internal controls. So a very clean audit. And I'd like to commend the Finance Department because of those results. And there were no unusual transactions other than there was one new standard that had to be implemented this year called ASC 842, which is entitled leases, and it required the school to put leases on the book for the first time as both a right of use asset and related liability. And they consulted our Weaver Advisory Services group, which helped with the implementation of that. As I mentioned, there were no material weaknesses, no significant deficiencies. We really encountered no difficulties whatsoever in conducting our audit. I'm also happy to report that there were no significant journal posted to the financial statements as a result of our audit procedures, and if there were no what we call uncorrected misstatements, which are ones where they're not material to the financial statements, but we chose to pass. We didn't have any of those either. This just basically summarizes what I just told you. So great news all around. And then I mentioned that I have a few slides that I just wanted to share with you that just kind of highlight some of the financial activity. This slide right here just talks about the school's net assets, which totaled $51.4 million as of fiscal year end. And that was an increase of about $3 million. And there were a number of factors that came into play here. I just pointed one of them out. That was partially due to a $2.1 million gain on the extinguishment of the note from Roosevelt Property Company. And overall, revenues exceeded expenses this year by just under $1 million. Pressing the wrong button. Okay. Sorry about that. I didn't go through formal training for this. So, this next slide gives you a trend analysis of sorts of the school's revenues over the past 3 years, breaking things down into local support, state program revenues, and federal revenues. And you can see here that local revenue went down this year from 11.7 to 8.6 million. Basically, the contribution revenue was reduced by about $2 million, and investment income decreased as well. State program revenue, however, increased by almost $18 million over the previous year. That's mostly a result of the foundation state program revenue. And then federal program revenues increased as well from 18.8 to $25.3 million this year. A lot of this was COVID-related money, the $2.1 million of ESSER grant money that the school had this year. Title I increased by $1.3 million, and the coronavirus relief fund money was $2.1 million that was recognized this year. And then finally, on the expense side, you can see the expenses increased both on program services as well as supporting services. Much of this was related to payroll as well as professional and contractual services. And that in a nutshell is my presentation. And again, it was a very successful audit, and I'd be happy to answer any questions if anyone has.
Again, yesterday the audit committee met with Weaver and spent a good part of 45 minutes with them, so we've got a little more in-depth review in advance of this. And so at this point, really just looking to see if you have any questions. If not, I'll entertain a motion to approve the 2021 fiscal year audit as presented.
A motion that we accept it.
Second. Thank you, Collins. Second. Are there any votes against the motion? Hearing none, the motion is approved by unanimous vote. Again, I want to thank the Weaver team, in addition to Jim, Betsy, and Stephen, and the entire finance team, for all their tireless work on this audit. Again, as you can imagine, there was a lot of uniqueness and challenging audit issues that they dealt with because of the pandemic, and a lot of twists and turns as things were evolving at the state level and federal level. Again, the ESSER funds and the lease accounting were two of the major areas. And again, we're just thankful that the team got through it, and also got through it in a very, very timely manner in order for us to issue our financials by really before the holiday weekend. So congratulations to the team.
We're going to be going to closed session.
Yeah,
The
so
law, the Weaver team out. Do you want to put us into closed session?
so it's now 4:50 p.m. and we're going to move to the next course of business, which is to move it to retire to closed session. Thank you all again for joining us, and Jim, you're gonna see them out?
Yeah.
Good. So the board will retire to closed session to conduct a private consultation with its attorney pursuant to Texas Government Code 551.01. I ask everyone to please exit the room or virtual meeting except for board members Yasmin, Rooney, and Alex.
And we'll keep Priscilla too, since we're gonna talk about Meridian.
Yeah, we'll keep. The time is now 4:51 p.m. and the board is in closed session shortly. Ready? At this time, the board is returned to open session. The time is now 5:15 p.m. I note that the same quorum of the board is present. No decision or action is taken by the board during the closed session. As there is no further pending business before the board, this meeting is now hereby adjourned. The time is now 5:15